As a result, Allied bombers were striking the Bougainville complex and Kavieng even before Munda had been secured. Once Munda Point, Seiy Point, and Vella Lavella were transformed into operational fighter strips to support the bomber fields at Guadalcanal, and the Russells, Marine and 13th Air Force pilots had an array of excellent airfields, leaving the Bougainville base complex as their sole major target. As the Allied network of bases expanded throughout the Solomons and New Guinea, the enemy's own chain of islands shrank in tandem. It remained feasible, as demonstrated during the clashes of November and January, for Tokyo to send reinforcements to Rabaul, but the capacity to sustain an entire network of bases began to disintegrate as the Bougainville shield crumbled. Allied fighter pilots in the Solomons also observed that enemy forces were starting to husband their strength. Fighter casualties from all causes had been so staggering over the past year that confronting every single raid would have led to the swift annihilation of their air arm. Furthermore, Bougainville lay deep inside the transport kill zone, necessitating supply by barge. Allied barge busters played a crucial role in keeping Imperial forces chronically short of vital supplies. This scarcity was another reason for their caution, as it diminished their ability to repair aircraft damaged in combat. On some days, their fighters would attempt to remain concealed. On others, they would pointedly evade combat. Then there were days they chose to fight, which invariably resulted in losses. Yet, one thing that could not be stopped was the enemy's anti-aircraft defenses, however crude they might have been. While dangerous for medium bombers, they were even more lethal against the SBDs and Avengers. SBD pilot Roy Vance recalled a mission that went terribly wrong. Our briefing was always around a giant map. We consistently launched in the darkness, around 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning. If there wasn't any new intelligence, they'd just let us hang around, smoke, and chat. Eventually, some commanding officer would stroll in and declare, "This is the one." He would then indicate a specific gun emplacement that was causing major problems. The order would be simple: silence that gun. At times, I wasn't entirely convinced they were concerned about how many dive bombers were lost. The priority was just to neutralize that gun, because doing so would suppress the entire airfield for a time. That would allow the fighters to sweep through all day, strafing and dropping bombs. I remember one day when Boyington's squadron, with whom we shared a field, conducted a raid on Kahili. They decided to shoot up the control tower. The news was already on the radio. They took their F-4S and riddled the tower, knowing we had dealt with the anti-aircraft guns. The very next day, the enemy installed new gun mounts there and shot down a fighter. And the day after that, they called us dive bombers in. It's always nice to feel needed. At Kavieng, they had these gun mounts that, we were told, were salvaged from a damaged cruiser. They were positioned right at the end of the runway. I believe all 28 of us went on that mission, but they mauled us and 5 of our aircraft never returned. Just 2 days later, we had to go back again after a different squadron got torn to pieces. It was only then that some sharp intelligence officer figured out the fire control system was on the opposite side of the runway. We had been bombing the wrong target entirely. When you commenced your dive, the goal was to get through that curtain of flak as quickly as humanly possible. They'd be firing long before you even started your run. But as soon as you rolled over into your dive, the gunners below would typically scramble for cover until the last plane was clear. Then they'd pop back into their emplacements and start firing again. Only now they were shooting at your tail. I reckon the flak in the South Pacific was far less intense than in Europe, but it still chipped away at our squadrons relentlessly. The losses just kept piling up. When we weren't tasked with hitting gun positions, we were bombing the airstrips. There could be 28 of us on a single run, a substantial attack. If we managed to place those 1,000-pound bombs on the runway, they couldn't patch it up overnight. The 500 or 100-pound bombs allowed for quicker repairs, but we kept hammering them regardless. Several TBF squadrons took part in the final offensives. In the Solomons, torpedoes were often left behind as Avengers began to execute glide bombing attacks on airfields. The TBF could carry a considerable bomb load, making the aircraft exceptionally well-suited for pounding airstrips. Much like the SBDs, however, they were quite susceptible to anti-aircraft fire. Frank Colby, a turret gunner in an Avenger, described a glide bombing run on an enemy airfield. We were bombing airfields in the central Solomons and then pushed farther north after Munda was captured. We'd approach the target area at about 10,000 to 12,000 feet, and the pilots would form a straight line. The lead pilot would signal by rocking his wings back and forth, then peel off into what was termed a glide. Perhaps they could have found a more fitting name, because the dive was actually quite precipitous. The TBF was a robust plane and could handle a steep dive, and our objective was to release our bombs and exit the flak zone in a hurry. I would keep an eye on the plane behind us, and I could see the moment the pilot released his bomb. There would be a sudden jerk, and the ordnance would seem to slowly separate from the plane and begin its descent. Of course, my primary duty was to scan for enemy fighters. Thanks to our escorts, we rarely encountered them. What we did see were black puffs of smoke erupting all around us. Initially, they were maybe 50 feet behind our plane. It seemed those gunners on the ground were either not very accurate, or perhaps we were moving faster than they estimated. On subsequent missions, those black puffs got progressively closer. Sometimes I'd peek out my escape hatch, and there would be anti-aircraft bursts that appeared to be detonating just 10 or 15 feet away. On one occasion, I looked up at the aircraft behind us, and just as its bombs separated from the bomb bay, a black puff of smoke appeared that I could have sworn exploded right inside the bomb bay itself. Miraculously, we all made it through that mission unscathed. Then one day our luck ran out. They finally hit us. I felt a tremendous jolt. It was as if the plane had been stopped dead in its tracks. My escape hatch was blown clean off, and the horizontal stabilizer on the port side simply vanished. It felt as if we had stopped, lurched upward, and then began to tumble. It seemed like an eternity, but it was likely only a matter of seconds. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, asking if everything was okay in the back. Both the radio man and I confirmed we were all right. The pilot responded, "Hang on tight. Let's see what this machine can still do gradually." I could feel the plane beginning to answer the pilot's controls. He was fighting to pull it out of the dive. After a short while, we were flying level right over the very airstrip we had bombed so many times. Once we cleared the end of the strip, we were out over open water. The pilot decided to attempt a return to Rendova. We could feel the nose kept trying to rise, but we were still losing altitude. Finally, as we neared the island, I looked over my gun and could see treetops. I glanced down and saw the ground perhaps 15 feet below us, but we were flying level. We made it back, or I likely wouldn't be recounting this story. The landing was far from the smoothest I've ever experienced. As we wobbled from side to side, we managed to pull over to our revetment and climb out. We were profoundly glad to feel solid ground beneath our feet. That plane never flew another mission. Under the crushing weight of these massed attacks, the Bougainville bases began to buckle. In July 1943, Rabaul had integrated 150 aircraft from Carrier Division II into the 26th Air Flotilla and dispatched them to relieve the already beleaguered units at Bin. Kenji Tanaka was stationed at Bin during those grim hours for the Empire. He watched in horror as malnutrition started to impair the vision of his pilots and the overall health of his entire unit. He described the conditions that September. The ceaseless air battles against the ferociously fighting Americans were exacting a heavy and unrelenting toll on our men. The constant fighter interceptions and bombing missions meant that scarcely a day went by without men being killed or sustaining serious injuries. The pilots and aircrews had no genuine expectation of surviving their tour of duty, for the steady attrition meant that no one could foresee the moment of his own demise. I could not fathom the attitude of our naval command, which treated its personnel with unnecessary severity and what appeared to be a complete lack of concern. Of the 150 aircrew members who had arrived with me at Bin just 1 month earlier, at least 50 were already dead. We were certain that before another month passed, more than half of the remaining men would also be lost. Here at Bin, we were suffering most grievously from the loss of our lieutenant junior grade officers, who were the core of our fighter pilot force. 13 of these men had arrived in the South Pacific 18 months prior. Only one of them was still alive. Tanaka was eventually transferred back to Japan to help rebuild Carrier Division II, before he returned with it in January to take part in the final act at Rabaul. His former staff at Bin, however, kept him well informed of the unfolding events. By October, Bin was finished. By the middle of October, the enemy air raids against the 26th Air Flotilla at Bin had become unbearable. With its base constantly subjected to enemy bombs and strafing, with living conditions reduced to the barest minimum, and with a mounting loss of supply vessels, the Navy withdrew, moving its remaining strength directly to Rabaul. The Navy could not continue to endure indefinitely the ever-escalating enemy air power, and our position was deteriorating rapidly. This was not a decision made lightly at Rabaul. Bin, along with Kahili, was the most formidable Imperial base on Bougainville and was expected to be attacked in the near future. If Bougainville were to fall, then Rabaul itself would be exposed to an all-out assault. After the war, American interrogators questioned Captain Hideo Sato, a senior staff officer of the 25th Air Flotilla at Rabaul for most of the war, about the point at which the staff at Rabaul believed the Solomons campaign was truly lost. Sato answered concisely, in October 1943, when the 26th Air Flotilla withdrew their planes from Bin, the Torquemada landing occurred on November 1, 1943. After the anticipated air counterattack failed to significantly disrupt the landing operations, an American beachhead was firmly established within 2 days. Within a matter of weeks, 3 airstrips were operational on the western coast of Bougainville. The final assault on Rabaul was ready from the perspective of Allied forces in the Solomons. Courtesy of the 5th Air Force, the attack had, in fact, already begun. In early October 1943, Rabaul appeared to be ripe for the taking. The number of aircraft at the base was not much more than 150, and its Bougainville shield, which fielded a similar number of planes, was collapsing. Morrison and his officers had been planning for the landing at Torquemada. McCrae had decided to seize Cape Gloucester and the Arar Islands on the western side of New Britain. Naturally, the two forces pledged simultaneous support for one another. And just as naturally, nothing unfolded exactly as planned. Nonetheless, the air garrison at Rabaul was caught in a trap. It could either fight until it was annihilated, attempt to flee, or be reinforced. Following the September decision in Tokyo to defend the South Pacific to the last man as a means of delaying Allied advances elsewhere, Imperial forces stumbled into one of their most catastrophic air defeats of the entire war. The 5th Air Force had long been attacking Rabaul with great determination, but the results had been mixed. In the fall, Australian and American engineers constructed fighter bases for P-38s on small islands to the southwest of Rabaul. The bombers, however, needed no such assistance. Bombers based at Dobadura and Moresby had one final act to perform before being relocated northward. The first major attack on Rabaul took place on October 12, 1943. Unlike previous raids, this assault was mounted in broad daylight and was massive. It comprised over 100 B-25 strafers, 40 heavy bombers, and a substantial escort of P-38s. It was a significant success, though it did not fully meet expectations. The men attacking Rabaul were well aware of its formidable defenses. They respected this reality at a time when United States bombers in Europe were challenging both fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Nighttime bombing missions on Rabaul and precise reconnaissance had given the pilots of the 5th Air Force an excellent understanding that Rabaul's anti-aircraft and fighter defenses were far more potent than anything they had encountered in New Guinea. Glenn Foster was a pilot in one of the B-25s on that first attack. Rabaul was the toughest target, no question. It was heavily defended, a long way to go. After a while, you start to think, well, it's just another mission. But some missions were a lot more dangerous than others, and you knew it. We had a reunion recently, and one pilot was talking about looking at the crews before the first Rabaul raids, and he said those crews looked scared to death. We never really thought of it that way, but we did wonder if we'd have the courage to climb into that airplane. Everyone knew on a tough one that the odds were not everyone was coming back. And in the back of your mind, you'd wonder, is it my turn? But that was just part of our business. You can't imagine what you had to fly through at Rabaul. They had 4 airfields, so there were fighters everywhere. All that naval ordnance. It was pretty intense. On our big Rabaul raid, we only lost 1 plane. The place is shaped like a bowl. We came in from the east to attack shipping in Simpson Harbor. I was on the inside of our line abreast formation of 12 aircraft. I knew if any of those guys turned into me, they'd cause me to stall. So when I reached the turning point, I banked immediately. My wingman followed me, The others kept going straight. So it was just the two of us heading for the harbor. My wingman was shot down almost right away. I put the nose down, right on the water, and told my co-pilot to keep his feet on the throttles. We roared through there wide open, right on the deck. We lined up on this freighter, the first one we saw. I certainly wasn't being picky. We got to the drop point and let go. I yanked the stick back, and to this day, I have no idea how we didn't take the ship's superstructure with us. We passed so close and then dropped right back down to the deck. As we flew on, we went right over an airfield and got a nice welcome there, too. But we made it through and turned for home. You can see the flak so clearly. It's bursting all around you, and the flash of the guns on the ground is incredibly visible. Most guys aren't sightseeing, though. You're much better off just concentrating on the target and not thinking about the flak. Protected by a network of observation posts and radar, Rabaul was difficult to attack by surprise. The October 12th assault, however, was the first of its kind, and Imperial forces were caught unprepared. Strafer pilot Sam Keller experienced, to his benefit, the type of aircraft misidentification that plagued both sides throughout the conflict. On my very first mission to Rabaul, we actually got a green light from a guy in the control tower. He had no idea we were the enemy. He was completely taken by surprise. We had just come in low over the water, popped up over this ridge, and then right there in front of us was this airfield with aircraft parked everywhere. The guy in the tower probably couldn't tell a B-25 from a steam engine. He gave us the green light to land. We didn't land. We blew him right out of his tower. We were dropping parafrags and larger bombs at the same time we were strafing in a low-level attack. There was no real defense. We destroyed a lot of airplanes that day. On that first day, the strafers of the 5th Air Force destroyed at least 40 aircraft on the ground. The few fighters that managed to get airborne were dealt with by the escorts. The strafers and B-24s claimed a significant number of hits against the large merchant and naval force in Simpson Bay. Enemy forces later asserted that only one ship was sunk, but admitted that 20 merchantmen were damaged to varying degrees. The 5th Air Force conducted several other raids against Rabaul until the end of November. More planes were caught on the ground, and more Zeros were shot down in the air. However, American losses also began to mount considerably, with 14 aircraft lost on November 2nd. Admiral Morrison was not pleased with this performance, as he correctly believed that his own invasion force was the primary target for aircraft based in that area. Under most circumstances, these early raids against Rabaul by the 5th Air Force would have been deemed a great success. Kearny, however, was a McCrae man, always inclined to promise a great deal and, if the promise wasn't met, to claim a phantom victory. Kearny's victory claims in his memoirs were seriously exaggerated. Meanwhile, his forces had to confront a large buildup of powerful enemy forces. Imperial forces had some remarkably good fortune in October. Attacking Rabaul from Dobadura was a long haul, and for many days, bad weather halted or disrupted the 5th Air Force's attacks. Had the weather been favorable, Kearny's forces would have undoubtedly applied the standard 5th Air Force treatment to Rabaul with considerable effect. For the tactics that had been applied to Wewak, Hollandia, and many other bases to work, it was essential for the attacks to be relentless. In the event, the 5th Air Force made only periodic attacks on Rabaul throughout October and early November. Had there been 5 consecutive days of good weather, the largest air battle of the Pacific War might have taken place, and the 5th Air Force would have had an excellent chance of winning it. Instead, while Morrison was preparing the Torquemada invasion, Carrier Division 1 with some 200 aircraft arrived from Truk to Rabaul, along with a large surface fleet. It stands as one of the great ironies of the South Pacific Air War that Imperial forces reached their peak strength at Rabaul and nearby bases at well over 400 planes. Furthermore, the reinforcement pipeline continued to flow, and another 150 planes from Carrier Division 2 would arrive in January. The rabbit was indeed caught in the snare. As events unfolded, the aircraft of the 5th Air Force probably weakened the Rabaul garrison more by defending their own invasion fleets and fighting over the landing zones in New Britain than by directly attacking Rabaul. The 5th Air Force did, however, prevent the Imperial Army Air Force from joining the fight for Rabaul. The Imperial Army Air Force could have added at least 400 more aircraft to the defense had supplies been sufficient. The 5th Air Force continued its high-altitude attacks on Rabaul throughout the campaign. As discussed in earlier sections, the Imperial Navy had suffered serious losses in New Guinea before handing the theater over to the Imperial Army in the summer of 1943. In late October, Imperial forces launched one of their last major raids on Allied shipping in Oro Bay, failing to inflict substantial damage but greatly adding to the scores of the 5th Air Force's aces. In December, McCrae sent United States Army forces against the Araa Islands in southwestern New Britain. Imperial forces attacked the landings vigorously with planes from Rabaul and what remained at Gasmata. The ground defense was skillful but ultimately futile. Dozens of tactical aircraft and fighters were lost in a useless attempt to prevent the landings. 2 weeks later, the Marines attacked Cape Gloucester on the western tip of New Britain, for the only time under McRae's command. An even greater number of aircraft opposed that landing, and just as many were shot down. It is likely that Imperial forces lost some 70 aircraft attacking Allied shipping and trying to defend these two beachheads. These were planes that Rabaul could ill afford to lose as it reeled under the brilliant and vicious assault launched by Admiral Morrison's airmen from the Solomons. It was a form of justice that the Marine pilots and aircrews who had flirted with both strategic and personal annihilation during the Guadalcanal campaign were primarily responsible for the final destruction of air power at Rabaul. It was also fitting that their campaign received a tremendous boost from the 13th Air Force, whose original pilots had flown so intrepidly at Guadalcanal in inferior aircraft. The continued assistance of New Zealand's fighters and patrol bombers was greatly appreciated in one of World War II's most diverse commands. There was also a certain symmetry in the fact that the last act at Rabaul was initiated by the worst possible development from the Imperial perspective, the return of United States aircraft carriers to the battle. By November 1943, both sides had constructed new carriers. The Americans, however, were launching one large carrier, including escorts, almost every single month. Prior to January 1, 1944, the United States Navy commissioned 8 Essex-class heavy carriers and 9 Independence-class light carriers. The new heavy carriers were improved versions of the Enterprise and could carry 100 aircraft. The smaller carriers, designed for speed, armament, and range, sacrificed aircraft capacity and could launch around 50 aircraft of any type. More of both classes would enter service in 1944. Behind them were dozens of escort carriers, essentially converted merchant ships that carried between 25 and 40 aircraft but were slow and could not operate the most advanced Navy warplanes. To this group must be added the venerable Saratoga, which, along with HMS Victorious, relieved in late summer 1943, much to the delight of its sweltering crew, from service in the South Pacific, had been Morrison's sole active carrier during a tense period of battle in the summer of 1943. The Enterprise, America's greatest warship, rejoined the fleet in early 1944 as the single carrier specializing in night combat, the portal through which carrier aviation had to pass to enter the post-war era. Morrison's brilliant carrier raid was part of a battle that never materialized. Relying on valid early war experiences, Admiral Chester and his subordinates in October 1943 sent the new carriers on raids into the Gilbert and Marshall Islands to test the performance of the new ships and aircraft. During that period, the Hellcat became standard issue, and the Helldiver dive bomber was replacing the Dauntless. The Americans were spoiling for a fight. What they did not realize was that Imperial forces, with new carriers and carrier groups of their own, were also seeking a decisive battle. When the Americans withdrew from the Central Pacific for the time being, they left behind an enemy fleet that was in pursuit. It was one of the great missed opportunities of the war. There can be little doubt that the Americans would have crushed the enemy and perhaps hastened the war's end. For the moment, however, the United States Navy's new weapons returned to Pearl Harbor, their very limited mission accomplished. For the first time, the great Central Pacific versus Southwest Pacific debate was coming to the forefront throughout the theater. Indirectly, Imperial forces brought matters to a head with potentially historic results. In late October, reconnaissance aircraft sighted the Allied fleet that was landing New Zealand troops on the Treasury Islands. This prompted Admiral Takeo, the commander of the combined fleet, to send nearly 200 aircraft of Carrier Division 1, the best aircraft available, to Rabaul. Takeo also deployed a powerful force of heavy cruisers, hoping to replicate the Battle of Savo Island off the coast of Bougainville. The battle was already underway. Despite the misgivings of many officers, Admiral Hideki, who was the overall commander at Rabaul, sent 2 heavy and 2 light cruisers with several destroyers directly to Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville. Awaiting him on November 3, 1943, was a United States task force of destroyers and light cruisers. American light cruisers were classified by their armament, not their weight, and the new Cleveland-class U.S. cruisers that fought at Augusta Bay carried 12 6-inch guns and 10 5-inch guns and displaced more than 10,000 tons. An enemy light cruiser might be little more than an oversized destroyer. In a chaotic night battle, the United States Navy soundly defeated the Imperial force. Well-aimed gunfire and a series of collisions caused by U.S. Navy torpedo attacks resulted in the sinking of 1 light cruiser and 1 destroyer, and damage to another cruiser and 2 destroyers. The enemy column was forced to return to Rabaul in complete defeat. The defeated force entered Rabaul and met a column of 8 cruisers that had arrived at dawn on November 5th, and were in the process of refueling for a massive attack on the United States ships defending Torquemada. Morrison had advanced knowledge of the enemy's movements and had 2 carriers available, with another 3 on the way. Yet, to protect Torquemada, he did not have the luxury of waiting for reinforcements. Although Morrison believed the enemy cruiser force would be inside Rabaul's harbor, he still had to contend with nearly 400 aircraft, many of them with carrier training, whose actions he could not predict. The cool-headed Morrison sent the veteran Saratoga, which possessed the best-trained air group in the Pacific, along with the new light carrier Independence. Launching from east of Rabaul, Morrison relied on land-based fighters for cover and sent his entire carrier force toward Rabaul. Perhaps 70 enemy fighters were alerted by radar and were airborne, awaiting the strike. Recognizing the priority, the United States fighter pilots ignored the Imperial fighters and stayed close to the bombers, flying with them through the enemy's flak until the critical seconds just before the attack. Confused for a moment by this unconventional tactic and reluctant to fly into their own anti-aircraft fire in pursuit, the enemy fighters were unable to touch the U.S. bombers as they began their attack runs. Ultimately, the defenders shot down 10 U.S. aircraft for probably equal losses, but they watched as the Saratoga-S planes damaged 6 cruisers, several of them severely. Defeated twice in 3 days, the warships withdrew to the dubious safety of Truk. Bougainville was secure. 6 days later, 5 United States carriers struck Rabaul again. 1 destroyer was sunk, and 1 cruiser and 1 destroyer were damaged. Considering the size of the strike force, the results were disappointing. The new task force, which included the new heavy carriers Essex and Bunker Hill, along with the Independence, had found few warships to attack and received a very warm welcome from enemy fighters. The ships soon came under attack by perhaps 100 of Rabaul's land-based aircraft, most of them from Carrier Division 1. This counterattack taught the U.S. fighter pilots some unpleasant lessons about coordination and fleet defense. The first group of enemy attack aircraft slipped through with little interference. Future ace Jack Fleming was on the Bunker Hill that day and recalled that the air units had good equipment but were not yet seasoned. Rabaul was my first combat mission, and afterward, I wondered if I had received the right training. We had combat veterans on the ship, but most of us were new to the game. I just didn't have a concept of what was happening around me. I was flying wing on my division leader like we were in a parade formation. I was too close. I was mimicking every single one of his moves. So, I missed what was going on because I was glued to my leader. I never did that again. I learned to back off to where I could see as much of what was happening as the guy I was flying with. The first thing that really scared me was when my section leader shot down a Zero. I'm right on his wing, and the first time I see the Zero, it's already going down past us, smoking. I have no idea when my leader even opened fire because I was tucked in way too close on his wing. It was startling to see a burning fighter fly right over you and not have seen what made him burn. We knew from the radio chatter, and we could see them taking off from Rabaul. We could see them taking off 4 at a time. So I was wondering, what am I doing wrong? When I finally backed off, we joined up with some retreating bombers, and that helped keep the enemy away from them. I was sure we had better pilots and better planes, and soon I was proven right. But that first big fight was a real learning experience for many of us. The attacking airmen from the new carriers might have had some bad luck on their mission, but their commanders were sharp. Although initially poorly protected due to a serious problem in vectoring fighters to the threat, the new carriers maneuvered skillfully and avoided all the bombs that dropped nearby. It is undoubtedly fortunate that they did not face the highly skilled pilots who had attacked the Hornet a year earlier. Nevertheless, after some very anxious moments, all three carriers were safe. Their Hellcats found the rest of the attackers and smashed them. The carrier raid had one immediate effect. Major warships, many of them limping, departed from Rabaul. However, the retreat of the combined fleet from Rabaul had far greater ramifications than simply ending the attacks on Bougainville. A U.S. destroyer flotilla under the legendary Rear Admiral Arleigh 31 Knot Benson finished the surface war in the theater when it attacked 5 destroyers attempting to evacuate Buka on November 25, 1943, sinking 3 without suffering a scratch. Rabaul's commanders knew that another carrier raid was possible, that the 5th Air Force might return, and that a huge offensive was poised to come from the Solomons. In December, there were some 50 merchant ships of all sizes in Rabaul, landing supplies of all kinds, enough to keep the 60,000-man garrison alive until the war's end. However, the kill zone against merchant ships was established, by definition, the moment the Imperial warships departed. The last merchant ship left Rabaul in March 1944. The Great Base was stripped of its ability to supply complex operations of any kind. Relying on the extensive supplies already on hand, the only thing it could do was defend its air units for a few more weeks and keep its garrison ready for months. Morrison soon left the theater for greater fame, but his operations at Bougainville, followed by the carrier raids, were the work of a wizard. By December 1943, Rabaul was alone in the South Pacific, still being hit occasionally by the 5th Air Force. It was also being bombarded by the heavy and medium bombers of the 13th Air Force. In early December, the first fighter base became operational at Bougainville. By the end of the month, another fighter base was active, along with a medium bomber strip. The Solomon Air Command could now call upon 500 combat-ready aircraft within or close to Rabaul. Standing behind them were excellent reserves. Rabaul was being smashed in much the same way that the 5th Air Force had created its other victims. However, the grim procedure took longer because of Rabaul's great advantage beyond good anti-aircraft defenses. Its size. The major airfields were many miles apart, and neutralizing one still allowed for resistance from another. Yet, Rabaul had another advantage. Because it had been a major base for so long, its garrison had been able to accumulate a quantity of basic supplies that were much more elaborate than was typical for an Imperial base. Yet, this advantage was fleeting, as the garrison defending the base was itself so large. Some categories of basic supplies were used up quickly, and rations were cut back before the end of January. Nothing Imperial forces did made the area safe to live in. Malaria, dengue fever, and jungle rot plagued the garrison, flyers included. When Carrier Division 2 brought in the last group of effective fighting aircraft, its entire staff was hospitalized with malaria or dengue within 3 weeks. Yet, as long as Imperial forces were willing to reinforce the base from truck, this base could serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. In December and January, Marine and U.S. Army Air Forces pilots sank it. By the beginning of 1944, the Allies were learning a great deal about how to destroy air bases. 3 lessons were fundamental. First, major bombing attacks should be heavily escorted by fighters. Until January, a well-planned attack on Rabaul would include 2 fighters for every single-engine bomber. Second, the attack should hit every component of the base, both air and ground. Making an ally of the area's brutal climate, the attackers should make incessant physical labor a part of daily life. Turning good airfields into swamps with heavy bombs was crucial. Third, there should be no respite. It was vital to force the fighters to fly, the guns to fire, and the base's resources to be dissipated. The Marine and U.S. Army Air Force's attack on Rabaul brought this system to what was perhaps its highest peak. Often, the escorts would be deadly corsairs flown by the Black Sheep and the Jolly Rogers. They might also be the lethal P-38s that covered the bombing raids of the 13th Air Force. The 13th Air Force and New Zealand P-40s and P-39s continued to soldier on into this period, even as both were being replaced by corsairs. Because Allied fighters were so numerous and deadly, Rabaul's air officers cautioned their own fighters against engaging the escorts unless the situation was favorable. No doubt this was a sound order, but it created at Rabaul the very same situation faced by the P-39 fishing fleet of early 1942. The result was predictable. Corsairs, Lightnings, and Hellcats, there were several land-based squadrons active, would cover the bomber's flight, and after the attack they would strafe enemy positions. Soon enough, fighters were carrying bombs, which they could jettison in case of opposition. They were operating under the assumption that they would meet none. The targets of the SBDs, TBFs, and fighter bombers were gun emplacements, aircraft on the runways, and shipping. Roy Vance did not like Rabaul. In the early stages, when we first hit Rabaul, it was a real killer. It was worse than Kavieng. We would lose aircraft on every single mission. It had a mountain and a harbor. There was only one way for a dive bomber to attack those fields and that harbor. You had to get low because you couldn't get back high enough again to clear the next hill. They could bang away at you on the way in and on the way out. That long haul out to the open sea was a really tough run. Rabaul was a terrible place. If enemy accounts are at all accurate, Vance was on the mark. Lieutenant General Kenzo Ishii, Chief of Staff at Rabaul and head of the anti-aircraft effort, estimated that Imperial forces shot down 400 Allied aircraft during the attacks on Rabaul. He estimated that 100 fell to fighters and 300 to anti-aircraft fire. 90%, he claimed, were SBDs and other single-engine aircraft making ground attacks. These figures are higher than those found in some U.S. sources. As usual, none of the records are in complete agreement, but they do show the relative vulnerability of a single-engine aircraft when attacking at low altitude. The SBD and fighter bomber attacks were increasingly effective as the basic infrastructure of the four major airfields was obliterated. This job fell largely to TBFs making medium-altitude bomb runs and, more importantly, to the medium and heavy bombers of the 13th Air Force. Because the medium-altitude attack, there were no true high-level attacks in the Pacific after 1942. Seems, in retrospect, inappropriate for a theater without cities and factories. Its importance has been badly underrated. Early in the war, high-level attacks on shipping and ground targets rarely succeeded because the targets were so difficult to hit and the number of planes involved was so small. By late 1943, however, the equation had changed. A medium-level run had a great advantage over other types of attack. It was not vulnerable to low-level anti-aircraft fire. All medium and heavy bombers attacking in daylight had fighter support, so defensive attacks by Zeros were rare and almost welcomed, at least by the escorts. In addition, a 1,500-pound bomb dropped from 12,000 feet penetrated deeply and made an excellent crater, and any facilities identified prior to the attack were vulnerable to high-explosive bombs dropped by a good bombardier. Dismantling the airfields and destroying the buildings and tents required to keep aircraft in the air thus had a devastating effect in the long run. But in the short run, even a medium-level bombing mission was not something that most crewmen relished. Charlie Hayes of the 13th Air Force was on several bombing strikes against Rabaul. When we bombed Rabaul High, we always went in at 12,000 to 17,000 feet, for some reason. I don't know why. You'd look around and you couldn't see the other airplanes because the sky was so filled with flak. Why they didn't hit more of us, I have no idea. Once, we got 97% of our bombs on the runway, or so we were told by intelligence. In this type of mission, it was critical to be close because we all dropped our bombs when the leader did. So we flew very tight. You were within 3 or 4 feet of the leader's wingtip during a bomb run. You had to be, for accuracy's sake, with flak going off all the time. Ed Shapiro, like Hayes, flew a 13th Air Force B-25 against Rabaul. When we went in at medium level, you had a lead plane with a bombardier. We flew on his wing and dropped with him. We had some top-notch lead bombardiers. One guy was just terrific. One of the worst things is to get on a long bomb run. The 8th Air Force had 5-minute runs. Man, just straight ahead, kill the drift, hold the altitude, and that's deadly, flying through anti-aircraft fire. Our guy was so good he would take us on runs of less than a minute, and he'd hit the target. That's good. I was always happy to see him on the mission, but you would get hit. Flak sounded like little pings, like chunks of metal hitting the plane. The shells would explode, and you'd catch little bits of shrapnel. If you took a direct hit, it was all over for your aircraft. There's been a lot of psychological analysis since the war, but at the time, stress, and tension were not in vogue. You didn't do any self-analysis. You would just grit your teeth and hold your position in the formation and concentrate on your job. I'd say it was tougher on the crewmen that didn't have a job to do during the run, like I did. When we went on medium-level missions, we left our navigator behind because the lead plane handled that. We lost our bombardier with the strafer modifications. But the co-pilot and the radio operator really didn't have anything to do during the run. That had to be tense. I was very busy keeping formation and waiting for the lead plane to open its bomb bay doors and drop, and the gunners were scanning for fighters. But the movies are pretty accurate. You'd see these black puffs, and if they found your altitude, you'd worry a lot more. But what could you do? You were committed, so you just flew straight ahead. After the war, Commander Tanaka, who had suffered through the collapses of both Bin and Rabaul and thus understood well how an Imperial base slowly died, discussed with American officers the relative dangers posed by different types of Allied aircraft. B-24s were the most effective against our land bases. Because our fields were few, it was the size of the bomb that did the most harm. Little ones didn't do much damage. The number of crashes while attempting to land on damaged fields was very great after B-24 raids. In a place like Rabaul, where there were many fields, big bombs were not such a determining factor because we could always land on an auxiliary field. Bombing effectiveness depends on the target. The main thing that bothered us in our operations was having several fields hit at the same time, leaving nothing that could be used as an auxiliary. There were many ships sunk by dive bombers. Tanaka also discussed the deadly effect that carrier raids had on the major Imperial base at Truk, pointing out that they could make multiple raids in a single day. At Rabaul, the carriers launched only 2 major raids. However, as the Torquemada bases developed through December, Rabaul, in essence, had an aircraft carrier on its doorstep and was attacked incessantly by SBDs and TBFs. But they were not the only problem faced by Imperial forces. Vice Admiral Hideki, the overall naval commander at Rabaul, singled out the B-25 strafers and their parafrags as the most effective weapon against planes on the ground, noting that the low-level attacks did not give pilots sufficient time to get their planes into the air, and they were invariably taken by surprise. Although a 5th Air Force trademark, the B-25 squadrons of the 13th Air Force were also using strafers with deadly effect. Pilot Ed Shapiro described a strafer mission over Rabaul. The missed rendezvous between bombers and fighters he described was all too common. However, with enemy fighter strength wearing down and strafers on the loose, Shapiro's unit got aggressive. Low-level runs were risky, but an extraordinary experience. You didn't want to take a hit down there, but you were sure firing back. On several missions, we caught them completely by surprise. You'd see enemy personnel coming out of their foxholes, pulling on their pants. We caught them by complete surprise near Rabaul once. We had a briefing and a takeoff shortly after midnight. We were supposed to rendezvous with 40 Navy fighters. The idea was to be near Rabaul at exactly daybreak so we'd have enough light to see the target. We take off, look down, and see all sorts of lights circling. And off we go, thinking we've got a large escort. There were 2 squadrons of bombers, a total of 24 planes altogether. I was a flight leader. One of the escorts had gotten separated and was flying along and turned his landing lights on, trying to read the numbers on our tail to see which way his flight had gone. Up toward the Green Islands, we had to turn all of our lights off. We had little blue lights on top of the aircraft, formation lights, but they are very hard to see. So we head toward Rabaul. Dawn begins to break. We look around and we have 1 fighter with us. One squadron leader decided to abort with no cover. Away they went. My squadron leader said, "I don't see any fighters. Let's hit them." We spread out and hit Guadalcanal strip. We were 12 abreast with our 1 fighter. There were a lot of planes on the ground, a lot of revetments. That's when you bore in. When you see something to shoot at, you do it. We dropped our bombs over revetments if possible, then peeled off to make our escape over Simpson Harbor. As we broke over a cliff toward the harbor, we saw a line of ships beneath us that had pulled into Simpson, and they were all shooting at us. That Navy fighter got right down on the deck and started strafing those ships, taking the heat off us, and got out of there. When you start on the run, all 12 machine guns are firing. They quit one by one due to overheating or jamming. In the last 2 or 3 seconds, you've got one gun going putt, putt. But it was extremely exciting. Hard to describe. Once you start a low-level run, there was really no sense in sweating. Everything was so fast, and you were very busy. Rabaul did not go quietly, but signs of a breakdown were clear by mid-November, with all chance of delivering a defeat to the United States and New Zealand forces in the Bougainville area gone. Carrier Division 1 began to depart within 3 weeks of its arrival. It had lost nearly half of its 180 aircraft and a much higher percentage of its valuable attack planes. As should have been obvious to the Imperial High Command, the Allied air attack on Rabaul had only just begun and would reach a fever pitch in the weeks to follow. That was, of course, the logic behind the Torquemada operation. Although the 5th Air Force was occupied on New Britain and at Wewak, a renewed attack from that quarter could come at a moment's notice. The Royal Australian Air Force began a steady nighttime bombing campaign of Rabaul's installations with Beauforts, adding to the physical and psychological attrition. The combined fleet had left Rabaul, leaving the merchant shipping in dreadful danger. Imperial intelligence realized that the Americans were preparing to strike toward the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, the opening guns of the Central Pacific Drive. Everything argued for withdrawal. Instead, Imperial forces believed they were tying down more Allied forces than they were expending. In the very short run, this was true. However, the weeks or days they were gaining would later be given back in months lost. Industrial production in the homeland, crippled by a miserable system of strategic distribution, could barely keep up with the losses of aircraft. To the very end, at Rabaul, there were more pilots than available planes. Pilot training was being cut back just to man the aircraft coming off the assembly lines. Furthermore, those new planes, although technically superior to their predecessors, soon began to suffer from serious problems in workmanship and cut corners due to the lack of strategic resources. Fuel shortages began to plague both air and naval forces. The merchantmen and aircraft squandered at Rabaul after mid-November 1943 were second-rate by Allied standards, but of reasonably sound stock in Imperial terms. Instead of attempting some sort of deception, such as using bogus planes combined with multiple patrols that would avoid combat whenever possible, which would have kept the Allies happily bombing away at Rabaul for weeks, Imperial forces reinforced the base. As always, the exact numbers are not certain. After Carrier Division 1 left the theater, Rabaul still had some 140 aircraft, with a few more still on Bougainville. It is not recorded, but one might assume that an average of 50 replacement aircraft came into the theater during November. Another 40 joined in December. In addition, some 90 aircraft, 70% of them fighters from Carrier Division 2, joined the battle in late January. I would estimate that Imperial forces threw away at least 250 airplanes, piloted by some of the best men available, for no reason whatsoever, and dozens of merchant ships were sunk and damaged while unloading at and leaving Rabaul. It is difficult to believe that Imperial forces needed reconfirmation that SBDs and TBFs could sink ships, yet they found it in the waters in and near Rabaul. Day in and day out, Allied bombers struck Rabaul. When the Allied machine was rolling, the numbers of attacking aircraft were staggering in South Pacific terms. In January 1944, 263 sorties were flown by B-24s, 180 by B-25s, 386 by SBDs, and 227 by Avengers. Those bombers were accompanied by 1,850 fighter sorties. In the first 3 weeks of February, the sortie numbers were just as startling: 256 Liberators, 263 Mitchells, 244 Avengers, and 573 SBDs. The total fighter sorties declined to 1,600 because enemy interceptors were becoming more difficult to find. In other words, 2,400 bombers of all types, escorted by 3,500 fighters, were over Rabaul during a period of just 7 weeks. These figures are for the 13th Air Force and do not include attacks made by the 5th Air Force and Anzac units. The consequences for Imperial forces were simple enough. There were roughly 130 aircraft in the 26th Air Flotilla in mid-January. Knowing they were ruined as a force, Admiral Takeo ordered their relief by Carrier Division 2. Allied reconnaissance did not notice any decrease in Rabaul's strength during this period, so it is likely that the aircrews were flown out by air transport and their planes were left for replacement pilots and to serve as a reserve for the new Carrier Division. When Kenji Tanaka returned to Rabaul with Carrier Division 2, He was shocked by the psychological condition of the men he had left just a few months before. As Tanaka recalled, now they, the pilots he had let it been, were quick-tempered and harsh, their faces grimly set. The fighting spirit which had enabled us to ignore the worst of conditions at Bin was gone. The men lacked confidence. They appeared dull and apathetic. Tanaka found that this decay afflicted everyone, regardless of their rank. The endless days and nights became a nightmare. The young faces would become only briefly familiar, and then they would vanish forever into a bottomless abyss created by American guns. Eventually, some of our higher staff officers came to resemble living corpses, bereft of all spiritual and physical strength. Neither did the Navy ever consider the problems of our base maintenance personnel, who for months worked like slaves. They lived under terrible conditions, rarely with proper food or medical treatment. As Tanaka made clear, the men were reacting to the reality of war, not some form of panic. They believed they were losing, and they were right. I found upon my arrival at Rabaul an astonishing conviction that the war could not possibly be won, that all we were doing at Rabaul was merely postponing the inevitable. Our executive personnel at Rabaul were not deluded by promises of future successes. They were experts in military aviation and had personally undergone many engagements. There existed a growing feeling of our utter helplessness before this rising tide of American might. Despite these convictions, they could only continue to send our pilots and aircrews into combat and to their deaths. Who could blame them, then, for the mental regression into spiritual apathy and defeatism? Tanaka made an extremely unusual command decision. Under normal circumstances, when one unit relieved another, it was common for the men and squadron leaders to discuss the strategic situation so that those experienced in the theater could aid the new men. Tanaka was so startled by the defeatism shown by the men of the 26th Air Flotilla that he dispensed with the usual briefings and sent them to truck immediately. The commanders of Carrier Division 2 and the other planes left at Rabaul did what they could to counter the waves of Allied aircraft. They ordered their fighters not to engage a superior force. They began night attacks against Allied bases. Yet, despite all precautions, the force of more than 400 aircraft that had been based at Rabaul in November was down to perhaps 50 by late February. On February 17th, the United States carriers devastated Truk with a massive raid. The combined fleet surrendered to the inevitable and withdrew its remaining aircraft at Rabaul to Truk. Some officers talked about a counteroffensive against Rabaul, but it is unlikely that anyone but the true believers took such talk seriously. Rabaul was dead. The death of Rabaul is clear now, but at the time it was not. The base was still in operation and possessed a tremendous garrison. The possibility that the Empire might try to reinforce Rabaul once again and renew the fight was not out of the question. So, bombers of all types continued to pound the base throughout March. Significantly, Allied bomber flights began to fly alone, knowing that the primary danger now came from flak and not from fighters. The winding up of the South Pacific Air War took place quickly thereafter. McCrae was already contemplating very long leaps in his offensive, very afraid that if he did not, Washington would shut down the Southwest Pacific Theater, which was exactly what Admiral King and the Navy wanted to do. He also believed that Imperial forces were losing their cohesion and that a series of rapid strikes would be extremely effective. In this estimation, he was very correct. So, for reasons of personal prestige and strategic flair, McCrae and Morrison, always the oddest pair of collaborators, quickly demolished what was left of the Imperial position in the South Pacific. The first target was Kavieng, the way station for shipping coming from the Indies or Truk to Rabaul. It had a fine port, a powerful garrison, and an airfield, and was one of the best defended Imperial bases in the Pacific. But it was the shipping that both Morrison and Kearney were after. A carrier strike in early January netted little. Although busy with their frantic Satyr campaign, much of the 5th Air Force attacked the remaining air power and shipping near Kavieng. 2 ships that were sunk contained invaluable aviation ground crews being evacuated from Rabaul to Truk. At the same time, Morrison's forces seized the Green Islands southeast of Kavieng, tightening the noose around the Bismarcks. In March 1944, McCrae and Kearney ended the South Pacific campaign for good. North of Kavieng lay the Admiralty Islands. Their possession would do far more than just cut off the Bismarcks. They would also provide future actions with one of the best natural anchorages in the Pacific. Relying on an inaccurate reconnaissance report, McCrae attacked the Admiralties on February 29 with a small force. The Imperial forces there were large but badly placed. But U.S. troops landed in a place unexpected by the enemy, and by the time enemy forces were ready for major counterattacks, McCrae had reinforced his expedition. Kearny sent his fighters and strafers on a withering attack against enemy ground positions. Destroyers of the 7th Fleet stood close to shore and provided artillery support. Within a month, the Admiralties, menace to many Allied seamen, were secure. Although McRae's command had defied almost every convention of war, it had achieved a stunning victory with little cost. To cap the victory, Morrison dispatched a large force to the unoccupied island of Amiro, just northwest of Kavieng. By May 1st, there was a good coral airstrip in operation on Amiro, and Marine fighter squadrons were based there. Strategically, the seizure of the Admiralties and Amiro put the cork into the bottle as far as Rabaul and Kavieng were concerned. Yet, the vicious air campaign that had begun when Imperial forces struck Darwin and Moresby, and had consumed enormous blood and treasure from all involved, ended not with a bang but with a whimper. Anzac and United States aircraft continued to attack insignificant targets throughout the area until the war's end, tragically losing dozens more aircraft in the process. Completely isolated, Imperial forces at Rabaul, Wewak, and many other places waited in limbo for a final Allied attack, death by disease, or perhaps starvation. In the end, more than half of the 350,000 troops bypassed in the Bismarcks, Timor, and New Guinea lived to return to their homeland. However, the air forces these troops needed to fight an island war had long since been destroyed. The defeat of the Imperial Air Arm in the South Pacific was final and total. It is never easy to distinguish and rate the differences among the large and small factors in military campaigns. It is even more difficult when attempting to analyze, in this case, a merciless air campaign waged for 2 years in the South Pacific. There were no single engagements that determined the outcome of the campaign. And whereas leaders became the organizers of victory, once in the air, military aviators faced a version of the infantry squad war every day that weather allowed operations. In theory, one might simply chart the campaign by following a chronology of the line of battle, best represented by the seizures and losses of air bases. Yet, by definition, the physical seizure of these bases was done by sailors and infantrymen. Thus, the airmen created the strategic preconditions for successful offense and defense. But it is not possible to pinpoint a single moment when the tide of the air battle turned. That all reflects the innumerable variables involved in the South Pacific Air Campaign. Technology, broadly defined, and especially communications, radar, and aircraft quality, played crucial roles, and their relative sophistication changed constantly during the first 2 years of the Pacific War. Both sides refined their tactics in an attempt to get the most from their weapons, yet another important dynamic in the process. Imperial forces and the Allies both had to cope with a terrain that thwarted and physically sapped man and machine alike. Early in the operations, factors that proved so important on the ground were not yet clear, and they only grew in importance as the enemies settled in for a long slugfest. The skills of the pre-war pilots were exceptional on both sides. Yet the quality of training and preparation of young aviators also changed, almost imperceptibly. Thus, I think it is valuable to sum up my views on the South Pacific Air War and its place within the broader Pacific War. I would also like to offer an opinion as to why the Allied Air Arm, after a 2-year struggle, gained such a decisive victory over Imperial forces in the South Pacific. Given Germany's defeat in Russia, Imperial ambitions starting at Pearl Harbor were doomed to failure. No analysis of the Pacific War can begin without conceding the proposition that Europe first, the Allies' fundamental World War II strategy to control first the West, then the East, was the correct one. And trying to guess how Germany and Imperial forces might have collaborated had the Nazis won in Russia is only guesswork. When Nagumo's bombers were lurching from the Imperial carriers on December 7, 1941, the Red Army had already started its stunning counterattack against the Wehrmacht outside of Moscow. From the very outset of the war, then, Tokyo had very little margin for error. As Hitler's dream of empire expired, so too did Imperial hopes for victory. The duration of the larger conflict, however, with its immense human and political consequences, was very much determined by the course of battle in the Pacific. Looking at the larger structure of the war, the conflicts in the Pacific took on an irregular pace. In the first 6 months, Imperial forces expanded much like a blitzkrieg, employing forces that, by late war standards, would have been considered small. Their initial odds for success were excellent because their British, Australian, Dutch, and American opponents were disorganized and outnumbered. It is safe to say that no one in Canberra or the Pentagon in the days prior to Pearl Harbor expected Imperial forces to sweep through all of Southeast Asia, establish a stronghold on Rabaul, and move against the last Allied outpost on New Guinea by May 1942. With Imperial forces stopped from further extending their maritime line by the disaster at Midway, the Allies counterattacked sooner and more effectively than Tokyo had anticipated. Yet, between June 1942 and August 1943, the battle line in the Pacific had changed very little. The Allies had captured Guadalcanal and New Georgia. McRae and the Australians had seized Lae. That was still a long way from Tokyo. And it's no wonder that U.S. troops in the theater adopted the adage, Golden Gate in 1948 was not so different from what was expected in Washington. And many Allied military leaders thought any Pacific War would last at least 18 months longer than the war in Europe. Many held that belief as late as June 1944, when the Allies successfully landed in France while the Russians were smashing the Germans in the east. The assumption that Imperial forces would be offering formidable opposition for many months to come thus permeated Allied diplomacy until the conference at Yalta, and even Potsdam to a degree. However, in the year following the twin successes at Lae and New Georgia, the Pacific War moved like quicksilver. The air and naval units that were operating near New Georgia and the Huon Gulf in August 1943 smashed the Imperial barrier in a single year. Rabaul, Kavieng, and Wewak were pulverized or isolated by April. Much of New Guinea fell by June. At the same time, the long-expected drive from Pearl Harbor toward Tokyo was underway. The Americans took the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. In June 1944, as Eisenhower's troops were sealing Germany's doom at Normandy, the Americans crushed the Imperial Army and Navy at Saipan. 3 months later, Admiral Morrison and General McRae were ready to fall upon the Philippines. Unlike New Georgia, Luzon was quite close to the homeland and directly astride the supply lines between the Indies and the home islands. Considering such developments, which were catastrophic for Imperial forces, it is surprising that Washington, London, Moscow, and Tokyo all expected the Pacific War to last much longer than it did. I believe the major reason for that great error lay in a mistaken appreciation of what constituted the central theater of war in the Pacific, as opposed to that in Europe. Marshall and those who correctly believed in Europe first considered the Mediterranean theater to be secondary. They were correct, in my opinion, and nearly 2 years separated the attack on Sicily from the fall of Berlin. Marshall or any Russian general could have testified that the bulk of Germany's ground forces had not yet been engaged prior to the summer of 1943, and that only a direct battle against them would bring victory. The South Pacific, in the context of the Pacific War, appeared to be akin to the Mediterranean theater in Europe, a useful prelude to the real war. In fact, however, the South Pacific campaign was not the preliminary bout. It was the main event. Yet, that is not obvious if one only counts casualties and numbers. The fact is that the systematic disasters suffered by Imperial forces in the South Pacific dislocated the entire Imperial military apparatus and revealed glaring weaknesses that the Allies proved quick to exploit. Failures in the Solomons and New Guinea did not equate to an El Alamein or a Sicily. No, defeat in the jungle tropics was their Stalingrad. It is hard to overemphasize the shattering consequences that the loss of Rabaul and New Guinea had on the Imperial Army. In 1943, the Imperial military had one last chance to redeploy its major forces against an anticipated Allied thrust. Like the Americans, Imperial forces had been making war plans long before Pearl Harbor. The possibility that the Americans would advance from Pearl Harbor directly toward the homeland was an obvious danger in the long run. In the weeks after Midway, however, Imperial forces believed they would have considerable time to rebuild their carrier forces and prepare for another great battle with the Pacific Fleet. Still confident, some firebrands in the Imperial Navy continued to think of limited offensives. The Army, frustrated by the Coral Sea defeat, sent a substantial force to New Guinea to attack Moresby overland. The Navy's brilliant but risky move at Guadalcanal was a calamity for Imperial forces. Still, it is possible that had Admiral Nomura, who seemed quick to understand the potential catastrophe building in the Solomons, been willing to roll the dice, Imperial forces might have destroyed the marine expedition. It is also possible that had the combined fleet staked the entire war on a sustained offensive, including a close blockade of Guadalcanal, the Pacific Fleet would have prevailed nonetheless, executing another midway during the fall of 1942 and thereby psychologically crushing the Imperial leadership. Yet, considering the huge advantage in shipbuilding capacity held by the United States and the hundreds of U.S. warships already under construction after Pearl Harbor, 1942 was not a time for Imperial forces to play it safe. If a conservative policy was deemed necessary, Nomura was unwise to fight for Guadalcanal at all. It would have been far better to retreat to New Georgia, reinforce the island, and wait for the Americans while assisting the Imperial Army at Buna. Imperial forces were faced with a situation fraught with peril either way. As it was, the combined fleet and its ground-based air units allowed themselves to be trapped in a brutal battle of attrition. They sent forces into Guadalcanal, but never in sufficient numbers to make victory likely. Like so many nations in the past, Imperial forces began to reinforce defeat. They tried to win Guadalcanal on the cheap, which was the worst possible approach to follow and ultimately the most costly. It was a turn of events so favorable to the Allied war effort that it might have been scripted in Washington. It is ironic that a strategic move initiated by an admiral who loathed McCrae gave that flawed man, but great general, the opportunity to put a strategic knife in the ribs of the empire. American historians have tended to divide the U.S. Solomons offensive, Navy and Marine, and the drive through the Southwest Pacific, U.S. Army and Australians, along service lines. The Imperial commanders at Rabaul and their superiors saw them as two parts of the same campaign, aimed at opening the doorway to Southeast Asia. Tokyo hoped that the Imperial Navy could contain Morrison and the Imperial Army could contain McCrae, yet it saw the Allied effort as a comprehensive assault on their maritime defense line. This was no small matter, as the resources of Southeast Asia were the prize Tokyo so coveted that it was willing to take on all of the Western democracies. Without oil, rubber, and rice from the Indies, a modern war economy was simply not possible, and Tokyo understood that completely. What is startling is how poorly the Imperial High Command balanced its defenses against a potential but obvious threat to the home islands with a more immediate danger to Southeast Asia. These calculations were not part of the Navy's playbook in Washington. The Navy wanted to tie down Imperial forces, prevent them from extending their perimeter, and force the Pentagon to send more resources to the Pacific. In the end, it succeeded, although not as well as had the perceived Imperial threat to Northern Australia in early 1942. Throughout 1942, despite the landings in North Africa, more U.S. forces went to the Pacific than to Europe. However, the Australian and U.S. airmen who held out while New Guinea was under siege established a strategic precedent of great consequence. Imperial forces could not just walk into Moresby and grab it. It would take ground units to add that land to the empire. At Guadalcanal, the same military equation applied. Once the U.S. Marines were ashore and the Cactus Air Force was in operation, the problem became one for the Imperial Army to handle. It was at this moment that Imperial forces failed to use air power on a level that rivaled Midway. A defeat though it was, because Imperial forces operated from far-off Rabaul and were unable to extinguish Cactus, it became perilous for the combined fleet to operate in the area, and it became hazardous and difficult to bring in Imperial troop reinforcements. This encouraged a short-sightedness and overcaution on the part of the combined fleet, which impeded the Imperial troop buildup on Guadalcanal. The ground attacks made against the U.S. perimeter in October failed, and had Tokyo been smart, Imperial forces would have withdrawn to New Georgia at that very moment. Instead, they continued to push. As important as the November naval battles were, the combined fleet would have had to defeat the U.S. Navy on a scale dwarfing Savo Island to prevent U.S. reinforcements from reaching Guadalcanal. The Americans had learned much in 3 months, and a total Imperial victory was unlikely given the forces the combined fleet allocated to the offensive. In the event, the Imperial Navy was defeated in November, which no doubt saved the lives of thousands of Imperial troops scheduled to reinforce Guadalcanal to renew the struggle. U.S. troops were building up at Espiritu Santo and Noumea, and nothing short of a complete Imperial naval blockade could have stopped them from reinforcing the garrison holding Cactus. As it was, U.S. troop strength passed 40,000 in November and 50,000 in December. Additional attacks would have only been met by more U.S. firepower, more U.S. infantry, and larger Imperial defeats. Strategically speaking, in the long run, the greatest significance of the U.S. victory at Guadalcanal was that it enabled McCrae to go over to the offensive. Most of the fighting and much of the planning in New Guinea was done by General Atherton's Australians, but there can be no doubt that the Kokoda Track epic and the miserable battles near Buna were influenced by Guadalcanal. It seems likely that the Australians would have held Moresby regardless of the Guadalcanal campaign, because Imperial forces had not committed sufficient troops to win the battle against the rapidly arriving Australian veterans. Getting Allied troops onto the northeastern shore of New Guinea was a different matter entirely. Because the Imperial Navy was deeply involved at Guadalcanal, it allowed the Americans and Australians to acquire a tenuous air superiority over the Buna area. Once cut off from supplies, the Buna area garrison, one of the most fanatical in military history, was destroyed. Still, the Buna campaign did not finish anything. Imperial forces rushed reinforcements to La, but their role, despite tentative plans for a renewed attack, would be defensive. There was no leader in World War II more air-minded than McCrae. And once Dobadura was secured, at a time when McCrae's navy consisted of a few fishing boats, yachts, minesweepers, and barges, it became obvious to him that he could crack open New Guinea in short order. Supported by the Royal Australian Air Force and the Australian Army, and a reinforced fleet, McCrae's forces easily seized La and Nadzab in September. None of this could have been achieved without fighter superiority, the ability to drop bombs on the enemy, and a large zone of air superiority within which the invaluable C-47s could operate. At the same time, Allied land-based air superiority covered a naval amphibious campaign conducted without carriers. By the fall of 1943, it was all too clear to Tokyo that the door to Southeast Asia had been cracked open. Tokyo also knew its industrial economy would collapse if that door was kicked in. In the early part of 1943, a flood of Imperial troops came to New Guinea and the Bismarcks to join a substantial garrison that had begun to build in late 1942, when ideas still existed about attacking Guadalcanal. These men, at least 350,000 strong, were trapped by Allied air superiority and naval mobility. The possible Australian drive from Darwin into the Indies pinned down another 100,000 Imperial troops awaiting a battle that never came. The Australians, following a different route, made the last Allied landing in the Pacific when they hit the Borneo oil fields in the summer of 1945. Another 400,000 men were fed into the trap when Tokyo ordered major reinforcements to the Philippines. American historians have argued for some 60 years about whether the conduct of the Pacific War was well accomplished or not. In a sense, that issue cannot be resolved. The perfect battle has never been fought, as the inevitable confusion of war, Karl von Clausewitz's friction, makes some misstep inevitable. However, it is a fact that the Imperial Army, as McCrae predicted from the beginning, put the bulk of its strength into the defense against the Southwest Pacific Drive. Still, McCrae was able to pen up some 250,000 troops in a de facto prisoner of war camp on New Guinea and another 100,000 in the Bismarcks. The garrisons at Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would have been far larger had the Imperial Army sent more of its field forces into the Central Pacific. By the time Imperial forces faced a debacle there, however, any attempt at reinforcement was fraught with peril, as any Imperial ship had to run a gauntlet of submarines and long-range bombers. Had those reinforcements been sent months earlier when it was still possible, the Central Pacific agony that faced American troops would have been very much worse. To put things in perspective, there were more Imperial troops trapped on New Guinea than were deployed in the entire Central Pacific theater. There were as many soldiers trapped on Bougainville as were faced by U.S. ground forces on Saipan and Iwo Jima combined. There were more regular infantry cut off on Rabaul than were defending Okinawa. McRae's forces paralyzed the Imperial Army and forced it into a bit player's role in the Central Pacific Drive aimed at Tokyo. The techniques that allowed this outcome were largely based on the accomplishments of the 5th Air Force and their allied comrades flying in the Solomons. The military techniques pioneered in the South Pacific, heavily dependent upon air power in all its aspects, helped McCrae paralyze Imperial ground defenses at little cost. Although the idea would no doubt have irked the Navy immensely, the chain of events it triggered at Guadalcanal led the Allies to attack the homeland from two directions. Considering the great size of the theater and the difficulty in redeploying forces, the change in Allied strategy endorsing some kind of two-armed pincer movement was predictable, if not inevitable. It certainly worked. By moving to threaten the Indies, McCrae ruined any chance for a concentrated Imperial defense in the Central Pacific. The result for McCrae's forces was one of the greatest victories in modern military history. There are still historians who question the importance of McCrae's Southwest Pacific offensive. However, the most cursory examination of the deployment of Imperial ground forces in the Pacific theater shows that Tokyo had no doubt that McCrae's forces threatened the very existence of the empire itself. That is why they sent the bulk of the Imperial Army's reserves to meet him. When Chester moved, it was too late to redeploy. Admiral Morrison's brilliant campaign in the South Pacific was nearly as fruitful. Although painfully aware that an attack by the United States Navy might come through the Central Pacific, Imperial forces were much too deeply involved at Rabaul to even interfere with the conquest of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands.